Hello and welcome again. It's David and Brent. Today we're on location. I'm in some exotic lodge in Lincoln, Nebraska, and Brent's in Austin, Texas. So I'm going to start this week off by talking about Brent's latest article, the $40 billion question. So Brent, thinking about trade deal, phase one trade deal. I guess it's January 9th. It's a Thursday that we're recording this. Phase one trade deal maybe coming next week on the 15th. So what did you write about this week? It ties into last week's conversation about the trade war resolution, but what do you have in mind and what did you share?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I think what we should do is we'll talk about kind of this $40 billion question first. Then we can probably discuss just a little bit about what the likelihood of, actually signing the phase one trade deal is. But there was just a lot of discussion about this phase one trade deal, and Trump has basically said, the Chinese have committed to 40 billion plus an option for 10 more, 40 billion with an option to go to 50, kind of thing. And the Chinese have been pretty circumspect about, well, I don't know if we're going to get there. They haven't said much at all in terms of details. So it kind of got us to thinking, and David had said something about, if you look at Chinese purchases, you kind of get historical purchases. We'll probably get to 50 billion someday. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, how realistic is it for us to get to $40 billion? And so what we did is it basically started with looking at past Chinese purchases of ag and ag-related products. And what you find pretty quickly is that, it's grown to $150 billion market of ag imports since 2000. So in 2000, the number was about 20 billion. In fact, that compound growth rate of Chinese, the compound growth rate of their purchases from all sources, imports, is 15%. So that's crazy. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. They're growing at 15%, and people say, well, that's not sustainable. It's not. I mean, that doubles every less than 4 years.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So if you even look at like 2010 to 2017, that growth rate's 7.5%. And so what you find pretty quickly is that, well, if they were to grow those purchases at, 7%, what kind of market share would the U.S. have to get to $40 billion? And the answer kind of surprised me. I mean, I was very skeptical of this $40 billion initially. I'm still very skeptical that we'll hit it in 2020. But by 2022, 2023, I think, we'll be there, because what we calculated was the market share they need to have at different growth rates. And I think at a 7% growth rate, we have to have 22% market share to get to $40 billion in like 2022. Well, that's pretty reasonable. I mean, we've been as high as 25%. We've been as low as about 18 before the trade war. So I guess after we looked at the data, I started to say, they basically committed to something they're going to get to anyway.
Your article had a couple things that jumped out to me. One of them was, if you drew a linear a line of that annual purchases that increased from 20 billion to 150 billion, it was like a $9 billion per year increase, which is just huge to think about. They're buying $9 billion of additional ag products from everywhere in the world each year. And the second one is that the U.S. has been on a declining market share over the last, from say 2012 to 2017, 18. And your idea is like, okay, by the time we get to 2020, if we just have a small improvement in market share and then growth continues, sort of a $40 billion a year in annual purchases kind of would be disappointing. There's sort of some upside to that bet. And so it's going to be interesting to see. We have a question in the Forecast Network. We drew the line at 35 billion for ag and ag-related purchases by China of the U.S. products. Like you said, I'm with you. I think it's a stretch goal for 2020, but this is a long-term trade situation, and I think there's still a lot of growth in the China story.
That data is eye-opening if you've never looked at it. To just look at the magnitude and the growth that's taken place in China, it's mind-blowing. And like we said, I mean, even if they grow at 3 or 4% from where they're at, it makes a real legitimate possibility that the U.S. can get to 40 billion. To me, it's just a question of when, not if, as long as we're trading with them. If we're not trading with them, then then we're in trouble. But if they get their hog industry kind of reestablished, and things in their economy doesn't just fall apart, I think we'll get there eventually. So in my mind, they've kind of given us something we were going to get eventually anyway. But it's still fun to like even think about that as opposed to thinking about how the heck we're going to survive without being able to sell them anything.
Yeah, I mean, if you knew that the data sort of before the trade war, we were in this $20 to $30 billion window, closer to $30 billion when we had $13 soybeans. On the lower end, closer to $20 billion before the trade war with lowest commodity prices. But now we've been much lower, about half of that, somewhere around the $10 billion neighborhood. So an increase back to the pre-trade war levels, and then almost doubling to that $40 billion. I guess one of the things I talked about the other day is it's hard to not be optimistic and a little bit skeptical at the same time when you think about the trade war possibilities.
Yeah, I mean it really is. That's a good way to sum it up. And then what do you think next week? Are they going to sign the deal or not?
So, I mean, you and I were trading emails earlier, and one of the things that you shared with me was that they have a date. It's the 15th. It's like 10 or 10:30 a.m. Central Time. The delegation's coming over a couple days earlier. It's a delegation of 10. They need to iron out a few details. And I think the last part of that quote included in that message you sent was the delegation from China said they are 90% sure they're going to sign this trade agreement. So I take the under of this 90%. I think there's a lot of devil left in the details for them to iron out. 2 days is a lot of time for this thing to blow up. I guess I'm at like an 80 or 85% chance that this thing gets signed on the 15th. But I think we got to recognize that we're not across the finish line yet. And I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, like I said to you, I mean, I'll take the average. Lighthizer said it's a done deal, so I've got him at 95%. He's saying 100%, and the Chinese are saying 90. And that may be wishful forecasting on my part, but they always say the last 10% is the hardest, right? But I think it's going to be a huge disappointment to the trade and to the industry if they don't get this deal done.
So I agree with you. Last year we had a very similar setup where we had that December 2018 meeting in Argentina where they went in this 90-day truce period, and we didn't get across the finish line there. And we saw more tariffs being put into place by the spring. I think if we don't get something signed on the 15th, it's probably going to be closer to an escalation of tension and not a neutral or de-escalation. So are there details that you're looking for in this trade deal that'll help you think about this probability of a $35 billion purchase here in 2020?
Well, certainly, I think the big thing is to look and see if there's any specific mentions of commodities. And I think they've been pretty clear at saying, we're going to buy commodities where they're most favorable in the world. So we're not just going to say, we're going to source X percent of our soybeans for the United States no matter what. I mean, they're not stupid. They're not going to do that because that puts them completely behind the 8 ball. But I think if you can see some mention of commodities that they're more interested in maybe than they have been in the past, that will be kind of nice to see. And then any kind of, volumetric or dollar numbers, I think would be pretty exciting. So I'm curious to see what happens. I'm cautious. I guess I'm pretty optimistic that it's going to get done. I'm going to be really disappointed if it doesn't. First of all, I'm going to lose the forecast question, and that's going to bum me out. But really, I think, we need to de-escalate this trade war, and that's what I've been telling people is that, it's really good news in my mind in the ag economy if we can get to a point where we're de-escalating the trade war instead of escalating it. We need that.
And to that point, the backdrop of a de-escalation as we sit in January 2020 is China is dealing with the African swine fever. So there might not be as much demand for soybeans, U.S. soybeans going to China, but that could be an opportunity for U.S. livestock producers, thinking about pork exports, beef, poultry. So I guess one of the things I'm looking for, like you said, specific commodities mentioned. At some point, you had a great chart. I don't know if it's on the platform yet, that basically half of all of our exports, that $20 to $30 billion in the past has been soybeans. So I'm looking for other exports that can grow and to make that pie bigger. Meat maybe is one that I'm particularly looking at, as well as renewable fuels, maybe ethanol. But there's other slices of that pie that could grow. One thing that surprised me is forest products is actually a pretty big
$3 billion.
It's a big slice of that pie. And I think for reference, soybeans are 12 to 13 billion. So it's a big number there. So I look for the alternative ones. I'm looking for time frames. Is there any sort of time frame? I wouldn't be surprised to say, they're going to start making $20 billion in purchases, but it's going to be from July 2020 to July 2021, which that could be a different time, or $40 billion from July 2020 to July 2021. That's a little different time frame. So I'm going to be looking for time frame issues. Also curious how they're going to maybe enforce it or measure it. One thing that we haven't talked a whole lot about is if we export ethanol, how does that count? In the USDA data looks at this a little bit. It's kind of in the weeds here, but it's maybe not an ag product, but it's a related product. So looking for those types of things.
Yeah, tons of that kind of stuff to be in there. I look for it to be more goal-based. These are kind of goals that we're going to shoot for, but I guess who knows? I'm optimistic they're going to sign it, I guess. The other thing we got tomorrow morning, the Super Bowl of USDA reports is coming out. A lot of interest in that to see what USDA actually does, with the numbers. I don't have any grand insight into that. I think it's always one of these marks in the sand where, it kind of sets the market's kind of view for the next month or so as to what the supply and demand situation is. Go ahead.
And the importance for this one, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that this is the quarterly stocks report, comes out with this. It's the first quarterly stocks report that happens after harvest. So it's sort of another ground truthing of what was 2019 production.
Yeah, it's an important report. So I guess we're just going to have to wait and see what that brings. But, I think it has the potential to be a really wild day, and it might be pretty quiet. I mean, it's just, I think it's a coin flip kind of deal.
Yeah. One of the things we were talking about beforehand is an article. It's on the Forecast Network. It's one of my favorite Forecast Network articles that's out there. It's called The Perils of More Data and Ideas That Make Us Better. And the story is a psychologist in the 1970s was gathered a group of horse bettors, or they call them handicappers. And they said, we want you to predict the outcome of 40 horse races. And they split up into 4 rounds. And there's 10 horses in each race. So they had for any given race, there's a coin flip chance, or a 1 in 10%, or a 1 in 10, or 10% chance that they'd get it right. So I think that's the base rate to keep in mind, that across this set of information, if you were just guessing blind, you should be able to get it right 10% of the time. So as part of the study, they want to see the role of information. So they gave them the first round. They said you can have 5 pieces of information. Maybe the horse age or the jockey's age or the jockey's weight, but you couldn't have anything like what race it was or the names. So nothing identifiable, but all the specifics. And they came back and they said, okay, give us your bet and then tell us what percentage, what your accuracy is. So these are really great bettors.
How confident you are.
Yeah, how confident you are. So they came back and they said, well, we think we were 90% accurate with this 5 pieces of 19% accurate with 5 pieces of information. And it turns out they were 17% right for this first round, 5 pieces of information, which is pretty good because,
right.
you know,
it went from 10% to 17. That's pretty good.
Yeah, the shot in the dark at 10% is 10%. So they were better than just a shot in the dark. So the next round they gave them 10 pieces of information. They doubled it. They said, okay,
better, right?
Should be better. So how confident are you? They came back and they said, like, oh, we're 23%. We'll get 23% right. And then the results came back basically 17%. So then they doubled it to 20, and they were even more confident, but their accuracy was still 17%. And then at 40 pieces of information in the last round, they're over 30% confident. So they're thinking they're going to get 3 out of every 10 races right, but they're only 17% accurate. So over this, as we added more pieces of information, they didn't become any more accurate, but their confidence nearly doubled. And it's a paradox. More information. We want to seek out more information to help inform our decision, but when does that information not actually give us more insight? When does it just give us false confidence? I think you got to ask yourself, am I becoming more accurate through the data that I'm looking at, or am I just fooling myself? So take a look at the article. There's actually a graph and a link to the study that's published. It's worth looking at. I don't know. I always find this, I read a couple articles around different sources, and the question is, did I read 3 different pieces of information, or is it the same piece of information repackaged 3 different ways? Every time I read it, it ingrains a little bit deeper, but it might not be new information.
Yeah, that's what I think, social media does in spades, right? It's an echo chamber. So you hear stuff over and over again. It greatly increases your perception that what you're hearing is right, and it may not be. So I think, we have to always value that information. There's a tendency to just, we got all this information now, we really know. But honestly, a lot of decisions you make, if you have those 5 things, most of the decision improvement you get is from those 5 things, and all that other stuff is pretty marginal. I mean, if it were really important, you would ask for it as part of the first 5 things you had to have, right? So a lot of times I think we fool ourselves into, high degree of confidence when we probably really shouldn't have it with more data. And it's not saying anything bad about data or, telling you don't look at data. It's just trying to say, think carefully about the value that it's adding. So that's a great study.
I like how you frame that, is that, you pick the first 5 pieces of information, which you basically, said this is the most valuable. And, as you kept going, the 40th piece of information was, by your own admission, was less valuable, but you kept putting more weight onto that. So that's a really good way to think about that as well. I also think about social media is, we read the article or the tweet or whatever it is, and then we look at how many retweets it has. And we also put weight on how many other people have liked it, which it increases the probability that we're going to see it, but it doesn't mean it's more or less accurate. So we assign some sort of weight to it that might not mean anything to the big scheme of things.
Well, I think the whole social media thing, you have to be super careful about how that influences your decision making. I just think it's bite-sized information packaged for kind of instant gratification, very little depth to it. So, I mean, Dave and I have talked about this whole trend toward, everybody, instead of writing a nice article, they write, tweets with 6 pages of tweet, 1 of 7, and you write this but it's still a sentence, and the depth, I don't know. I just think we're missing out by consuming things that way. And if you're already an expert, maybe it's a good way to summarize it. But if you're really trying to learn about that topic, you're never going to get the depth you need by consuming it that way.
Well said. Well said. I agree. So, and
Anyway.
it's, in a way, it's sort of giving an expert a platform to share snippets, which can be helpful if it encourages you to dig in deeper. But if there's nothing for you to dig in deeper to, you're just sort of taking someone's 30,000 foot view, and you don't know the assumptions that they were using or the data they were using to come to that assumptions. And you could reapply that into a different space and completely miss it.
There was a great one on Twitter the other day. This guy, he was like a climate scientist. He was talking about the carbon cycle and how here's how rangelands breathe or something. It's this really clever kind of depiction. And then this other climate scientist came on and was like, I wish you would stop doing this because it's so misleading. We can't even hardly measure carbon sequestration in the soils, let alone, tell people it's as simple. It's way more complicated than that. And so, again, she knew enough to know that that was a misleading but catchy kind of picture. And for those of us who don't know enough about it, we just probably go, oh, yeah, that makes sense, And I think, we've got to push ourselves to learn what the things that we really care about.
Well, I couldn't agree any more, and that's all we have to discuss this week. So stay tuned. We'll be back next week, and in the meantime, I encourage you to update your forecasts. We're going to be posting a new question here in the next week or so, talking about trend yields for 2020. Do we have any information at this point to start making some predictions about above or below trend corn or soybean yields here in the U.S.? And with that, we'll share some historic perspective and what's the probability of above trend corn yields with no information. So we'll start looking at that.
Well, it's not no information; it's your historical information. But yes, we know something.
We know something.
And everybody cross your fingers for phase 1 trade agreement to be signed by the time we take the air. That we'll have to discuss that next week. Or we're going to be discussing the aftermath of another failure, and we don't want to do that.
I'm at 80%. Brent's at 95%. We're here. We'll revisit it next week.
I'm going to be right. See you, David.
See you. Take care. Bye.